Today I am walking in the park in Rossville, just outside of my home in Collierville. They have had, a lot of storm damage, and there are limbs down everywhere. You may see some of those in the background. Let's just turn this camera around. There's utility trucks out everywhere, but this is a really pretty place to walk as I continue talking about the Apostles' Creed. And today I want to talk about the next description of God in the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed calls God the Almighty. Let me tell you what that means and what it doesn't mean. Now, let me start with what it doesn't mean. Sometimes people will ask some very ridiculous questions, such as, well, if God is almighty, can he make a square circle? And the answer to that is no. God cannot make a square circle because a square circle is a contradiction of terms. God does not do nonsensical things. God does not contradict himself. So no, God cannot make a square circle because that is a contradiction. Can God sin? And again, the answer is no. God cannot sin because sinning would not show God's strength. Sinning would be diminishment of God's character. It would be a diminishment of who he is. God is completely true to himself. Sin is always a diminishment of God's creation. It's always a diminishment of whoever participates in sin. And so God cannot sin, because that would be a diminishment of God, not a demonstration of his power. Well, can God make a rock so big that God himself cannot pick it up? Again, this is a clever word puzzle, but it has built into it a contradiction. The idea that God could somehow create something so big that he himself then would not be able to lift it or move it. The unmovable object meets the irresistible force. That one often comes up in first semester philosophy classes in college. But again, that would be to involve God in a contradiction. There's one more thing that we should say, and it really revolves around the idea that within the universe and within our world particularly is a struggle between good and evil. But when we talk about the struggle between good and evil, we're really talking about a struggle amongst finite beings. So there are human beings who have decided to side with evil. There are angels and other demonic forces and other things that have decided to participate in evil, while other beings have, humans and angels and so forth, have decided to align themselves with God and struggle for good and for the will of God. And obviously, all of that's not resolved in our world. Good and evil wrestle with one another and struggle with one another. But that struggle is a struggle between finite beings, not between God and the forces of evil. In fact, so what we mean when we talk about God being almighty is that God has no competitor in the universe, nor can God's resources and strength be exhausted. In fact, Isaiah chapter 40 will talk about how even young people, even people in the prime of their life, will grow weary and tired. But those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, because God himself is never exhausted. I saw an article in the satirical paper, The Onion, and it says, God, looking back at his work of creation, says that even he doesn't think he could any longer create the whole universe in 7 days. Now, I'll tell you honestly, I find that kind of funny because it's putting God in the position of an athlete who's long past his prime, who's looking back to his glory years and reminiscing, but realizing that he could no longer do the things he once could do. Well, obviously, that is not true of God. God does not grow old or tired. G.K. Chesterton says that. G.K. Chesterton says that because of sin, we, God's children, grow old, and paradoxically, it ends up making us older than our Heavenly Father. God is forever young. God is forever new and renewing creation. When we talk about the struggle between good and evil, one of the interesting things that the Jewish rabbis first pointed out was this idea that God makes room for others. In fact, the first thing God does in creation is he simply makes room. He withholds some of himself so that there's a place for a universe. There's a place for other beings in this story. God restrains himself. And one of the reasons that there is a struggle between good and evil in our world is because God restrains himself. He does not so overwhelm all the other actors in the story that they can no longer have capacity to act individually. And of course, that comes at a great risk and at a great cost, because God restraining himself means that the individuals have a certain amount of free will and capacity, and it means that they can actually work against God's plans and purposes. And God restrains himself, allowing angels, humans, perhaps other things that we can't name or know. He restrains himself, allowing them to make actual moral choices, some of which are not in accordance with his will. And we do know, and we do long for the day, one day, when all things are made new, and God deals with evil once and for all. But for now, God allows the story to unfold, and for individuals within that story to make real choices. But when evil rears its ugly head, it's not a sign that God is struggling or that God is incapable of facing down evil. It's actually a sign of God's goodness that he allows individuals to make choices, even the wrong kinds of choices. But God himself is almighty, and what that means is that God is fully capable of keeping his plans on track and fully bringing creation to the place where he intends it to be someday, in the renewal of all things. Well, hopefully that was helpful to you. Thank you for watching.